And today we unveil the running backs list, which is topped by the Titans' Derrick Henry. The two-time rushing yardage leader ran for over 2,000 yards and 17 touchdowns last year. At number 2, New Orleans' Alvin Kamara, who averaged 5 yards per rush, also led all backs in receptions and receiving yards last year, so the ultimate dual threat. Then number 3 is the Vikings' Dalvin Cook, second in rushing yards and rushing TDs last year, 30 total touchdowns over the last 2 seasons. Outside the top 3, you may notice, at number 7 is the Cowboys' Ezekiel Elliott, who had a drop-off last year, rushing for 979 yards and 6 touchdowns. And you take a look just to see who else is on the list. If you want to see who's ahead of Zeke right now, they've got Nick Chubb in there. You got McCaffrey coming back off an injury. Saquon Barkley coming back off a serious injury. And then you have Ezekiel Elliott. And that really brings up what I think is the big question, because there's so much attention on the Cowboys and the expectation for what they could be this season and how much of that will fall on their quarterback, who, in an enormous story, finally got the huge deal we all talked about. But how about Ezekiel Elliott, Sam? I mean, there are the stories of running backs who look as though they have sort of moved past their best days and then recapture them. Those are fairly few and far between. Do you think we have seen the best of Zeke Elliott?
By no means. I think the best of Zeke is still ahead of him. Let's not forget, Zeke got a pretty big contract not too long ago. And as we all know, when you're working for that contract, you work a little bit harder. Once those checks start coming in, you might get a little bit more complacent. So I think we saw a little bit of a complacent Zeke last year. He had fumbling issues, 6 fumbles in 2020. He had 2, 3, or even 4 in one game. They were recovered, thankfully, by his own team. But I think you're going to see Zeke return back to form. By no means is he past his prime. I think he's actually going to go back to the Zeke he used to be and be back in that top 3 or so running back conversation.
And Lewis, that feels to me as though it is critical, because the reality is, for as high-flying as that offense projects as though it might be, during this little mini run the Cowboys have had here, during this era, they have been by far at their best when they have run that offense through Ezekiel Elliott. Can they still do that?
Yeah, I absolutely think they can, and I think they will try to. I think they need to. I think they have to, because the complementary football is what's going to take Dallas from being the off-season darling and headline grabber as far as expectations to being the regular season actual accomplisher of what the off-season goals are, which is to try and be the NFC East champion and then be an NFC title contender. The only way they'll be able to do that is if they can, one, control the clock a little bit, keep their defense off the field, make sure that every game doesn't have to be put on Dak Prescott's shoulders. And the way you do that is by keeping defenses off balance. And you keep defenses off balance because your running back is the kind of guy who can really bust you in the mouth for 4.5 yards per clip and can go ahead and wind up having a season where he's 1,300 yards plus running the football, and he's still a threat out of the backfield as a receiver, which, don't forget, Ezekiel Elliott is. He's a guy who can run routes out of the backfield and who can pick up chunk yardage in the passing game, and he's a whale of a pass protector. So I think overall, he needs to return back to his normal form, the form that we're accustomed to seeing with him, because number 1, that's where he belongs. Number 2, that's where Dallas needs him if we're going to really be talking about this football team in January, which we never seem to be, although they dominate the headlines at this time of year.
I agree with that completely. Their best month generally has been June. We'll see what happens now as we work our way towards the weather getting colder. What do you think of all this, Jeff?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to Hembo about something else about Ryan Tannehill that actually applies to this. A lot of times we always think of the running back helping out the quarterback, but sometimes the quarterback also, their production can help the running back. And last year, Zeke didn't have his guy under center in Dak Prescott. And my point here is that Derrick Henry ranked 14th in rushing in 2019 when Tannehill replaced Mariota. Since then, he's had 1,000 more yards than any other back. So essentially, Derrick Henry's production, while everybody says, oh, the reason that Tannehill's good is because of Derrick Henry, sometimes it's also the opposite way. A quarterback can really help a running back as well. And I'm not trying to go into the Tannehill thing here, more so saying that Ezekiel Elliott, with Dak Prescott running the offense the way that he does, like when they were rookies, like that can be a huge help for a guy like Ezekiel Elliott when he had 1,500 plus yards and 15 touchdowns. I think they can get back to that with that dynamic duo, 1-2 punch of Dak Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott.
Yes, and if they do, then they could actually wind up being worth all the discussion that we will have about them come this fall. Guys, sit tight, much more as we go. But of course, we are in the little interim period here between games 3 and 4 of the NBA Finals. And Giannis Antetokounmpo was just brilliant on Sunday, getting the Bucks back on track. And yesterday, here on Get Up, our Cassidy Hubbarth had a really interesting thought on the key to Giannis unlocking his full potential.